Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, February 23rd, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The U.S. wants to prepare Israel for a multi-front war. So the Times of Israel reported this week that the $14 billion in additional military aid for Israel that President Biden is seeking was designed not just for operations in Gaza, but also to prepare Israel for a multi-front war. And they had a quote from a senior Biden administration official speaking to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency that said the $14 billion is, quote, for Israel to defend itself in a multi-front war and to be sure it can deter a multi-front war, end quote. So Israel has been escalating airstrikes in Lebanon against Hezbollah, though many strikes have killed civilians, as we've been covering. And this is one area that risks, a full-blown war, whether it be in the form of Israel actually invading southern Lebanon or just kind of ground fighting at the border. It's already pretty heavy, the airstrikes and rocket strikes across the border. So this is something that the U.S. is preparing, wanting to help Israel prepare for with this new $14 billion in military aid. And U.S. officials have even acknowledged to the Washington Post that they fear Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu might view war in Lebanon as key to his political survival. Israel has also been attempting to provoke Iran, or at least that's what it appears that they're doing here. They've killed several members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Syria over the past few months, and according to the New York Times, there was an attack on Iranian natural gas pipelines last week. And the New York Times reported that Israel was behind that attack. So a covert attack like that inside Iran. Israel does have a history of doing that, but still, it seems like what other purpose would they have than to try to provoke Iran? And so this $14 billion for Israel is packed inside the $95 billion foreign military aid bill that was passed by the Senate, but it still hasn't gone through the House. I haven't been staying super on top of kind of the drama in Congress over this bill, so I'm not exactly sure what the chances are of it being brought to the floor of the House for a vote at this point. I know the Republicans are still trying to get some sort of border deal. If it actually was put up for a vote, it would pass, and then Biden would sign it into law, but it's just not clear when it's going to be put up for a vote. So this is $14 billion for Israel, and it's on top of the $3.8 billion that the U.S. gives Israel each year. It includes $5.2 billion to go toward Israeli missile defenses, which is seen as a critical necessity for a war with Hezbollah, to increase their various types of air defense systems. The Iron Dome, David Sling is one of them, and then they're also working on the Iron Beam, which is a new laser air defense thing. So there's another $3.5 billion to replenish munitions that Israel has used in Gaza. And then there's $4 billion in there for the U.S. to replenish its own stockpiles of weapons that it sent to Israel or that it will send to Israel. And that includes this American contingency stockpile that's actually in Israel. And they've allowed the Israeli military to use that. I believe it's mostly things like artillery shells and other types of munitions. And Israel's depleted it, so they have to refill that. And since October 7th, the U.S. has been shipping bombs and other types of weapons to Israel very frequently. Over 25,000 tons of military equipment has been delivered. And it's not clear, some of that might be the $3.8 billion, part of the usual aid that Israel gets each year. But the U.S., the Pentagon, is not being transparent at all. You have all these people, a lot of Republicans in Congress, rightly, angry and making an issue about the lack of oversight of the aid to Ukraine. Well, if you look at the aid to Israel since October, there's been no transparency. The Pentagon, whenever they send anything to Ukraine, they announce it for the most part. I'm sure that there's some things they sent without making it public, And they put out these very detailed lists, but we haven't seen that with Israel. They're not even saying where exactly the money's coming from. So no transparency at all. And you don't really see anybody making a stink about that in Congress. But this just goes to show, the U.S. is not, if Israel does go to war in Lebanon, if Iran does get involved, the U.S. is going to back Israel 100%. All right, so the next one here, speaking of regional war, Yemen's Houthis hit another British-owned cargo ship. So according to U.S. Central Command, the Houthis struck another British-owned cargo ship on Thursday as the U.S. bombing campaign in Yemen is failing to deter Houthi attacks and has only escalated the situation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. So CENTCOM, which is the U.S. military command that oversees operations in the Middle East, said that 2 Houthi ballistic missiles fired into the Gulf of Aden impacted the MV Islander, which is a Palau-flagged British-owned cargo carrier, causing 1 minor injury and damage. CENTCOM said that the ship was still able to continue its voyage despite the damage. So earlier in the day, CENTCOM said U.S. aircraft and allied warships shot down 6 Houthi drones in the Red Sea. On Wednesday, the command said that it launched 4 strikes against Houthi-controlled Yemen and claimed that the bombings destroyed 7 mobile Houthi anti-ship cruise missiles and 1 mobile anti-ship ballistic missile. So this continues. I mean, this is every day now that we're seeing either the U.S. bombing Yemen, intercepting drones, the Houthis hitting cargo ships, or firing drones and missiles at U.S. warships. That's what CENTCOM said. It looked like these drones that they downed were fired at U.S. warships. And this ship, the Islander, is the second British ship that the Houthis successfully targeted this week. They also hit the Ruby Mar, which is a bulk carrier, and it caused significant enough damage for the crew to abandon ship. The Houthis said that they sank the vessel, but there was pictures of it on Thursday showing that it was down by the stern. The picture looks like it's on its way to sinking, and the ship operator is saying that right now it's being towed to Djibouti, but there's still a chance that it might sink. So it's just a mess, this whole situation over there. And the Houthis also struck 2 U.S.-owned cargo ships this week, causing minor damage. Again, this is just escalating every week. No matter how much the U.S. bombs them, it doesn't make a difference. And we had Biden say last month that when he was asked if the strikes against the Houthis were working, he said, no, they're not working. They're not stopping the attacks, but they're going to continue. So that's the attitude here. And now the EU is sending ships, I'm sure that's going to stop the Houthis. The EU's coming. But this, who knows what this could turn into one day. I know in one case, I believe it was a Houthi drone got really close to a U.S. warship. They shot it down with kind of their last line of defense. One day a drone or a Houthi missile could slip through. The U.S. destroyers and things, they have very advanced air defense capabilities, but you never know. Something could slip through and kill some American sailors, and who knows what would happen after that. So there's always this big risk of escalation. Same thing with the cargo ships. I mean, if they really start sinking them regularly or start killing people, so far the Houthi attacks on commercial shipping have not killed anybody, but that's just another potential escalation. All right, so the next one here, Doctors Without Borders slams the U.S. for vetoing Gaza ceasefire at the UN. So the head of the international medical charity Doctors Without Borders slammed the U.S. for vetoing a Gaza ceasefire resolution in testimony at the UN Security Council on Thursday, and detailed the horrors Palestinian children are facing in the Gaza Strip due to the Israeli siege. So this is MSF Secretary General. That's the French abbreviation. His name is Christopher Lockyer. He said, quote, "We are appalled by the willingness of the United States to use its powers as a permanent council member to obstruct efforts to adopt the most evident of resolutions, one demanding an immediate and sustained ceasefire. 3 times this council has had an opportunity to vote for the ceasefire that is so desperately needed, and 3 times the United States has used its veto power. A new draft resolution by the United States ostensibly calls for a ceasefire. However, this is misleading at best," end quote. And he's referring to this resolution that the U.S. is drawing up that calls for a temporary ceasefire if hostages are released, which doesn't really mean anything. And that's essentially the Israeli position. And it leaves open the possibility of Israel restarting its military operations after the truce. So describing the situation for Palestinian children, Lockyer said that medical teams have a new acronym. And this is really horrific. The new acronym is WCNSF, and that stands for Wounded Child No Surviving Family. He said that after seeing their family members killed, some children as young as 5 years old said that they no longer wanted to live. So this is really a tough thing to hear about. But he said, quote, children who survive this war will not only bear the visible wounds of traumatic injuries, but the invisible ones too. Those of repeated displacement, constant fear, and witnessing family members literally dismembered before their eyes. These psychological injuries have led children as young as 5 to tell us that they would prefer to die, end quote. So that's what our tax dollars are supporting in Gaza, a war against children. The death toll of children is something over around 12,500. The total death toll, it's getting close to 30,000 now, the number that Gaza's health ministry is putting out, and that's more than 69,000 wounded. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu to send negotiators to Paris for hostage deal talks. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has agreed to send negotiators for hostage deal talks with the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar in Paris on Friday after declining to participate in a previous round of talks. So the decision came after Brett McGurk, who is President Biden's top Middle East official on the National Security Council, met with Israeli officials in Israel on Thursday. According to a report from Axios, McGurk asked that Israeli negotiators be sent to Paris. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told McGurk that Israel will expand the authority to their hostage negotiators, but said that Israel is also preparing to continue intense ground operations in the Gaza Strip. So Benny Gantz, who's a minister in the Israeli War Cabinet, he's threatened that Israel will launch a full-scale assault on Rafah by the beginning of Ramadan, which is March 10th, which is pretty close. It's not very far away. He said that'll happen if Hamas doesn't release the hostages, and that deadline does not really give negotiators much time to work with here, considering it seems like they're kind of starting this new round of talks. There hasn't been much progress in the past week or so, and Rafah is going to be a bloodbath if they, launch a full invasion of the city. And the deal that the Biden administration is pushing, they're still saying that they want this deal for a 6-week truce, but it's unclear if Hamas is going to go for that. They're still pushing. They've been pushing for a permanent ceasefire, or actually the proposal that they put forward, the last known proposal that they put forward was for a 135-day ceasefire. But the idea was during that time, to work out a deal for a permanent ceasefire and an Israeli withdrawal. But that, of course, was very strongly rejected by Netanyahu. The Axios report said that the main sticking point between Israel and Hamas is over the number of Palestinian prisoners Israel would release. Hamas's proposal called for the release of at least 1,500 Palestinians. According to Haaretz, Israeli officials believe that Hamas may be willing to show more flexibility regarding the number of Palestinian prisoners, but they're saying that they think Hamas still wants a total end, a total ceasefire, which is something Israel is not going to go for. And for their part, Hamas is blaming the lack of a deal on Israel's unwillingness for a ceasefire, which they said in a statement on Thursday. So we'll see. And, again, with Netanyahu, his interest is keeping everything going. And if there is any kind of long ceasefire, everything in the region is going to calm down. And, it's just going to show the world even more why this shouldn't be happening in Gaza. So it's going to be tougher for him, I think, to restart it. So I would be surprised if we see him agree to any kind of significant ceasefire deal. All right, so the next one here, Israeli civilian misidentified on October 7th and killed by Israeli forces. Excuse me. This article is from Haaretz, and this is a Israeli who went to the Nova Music Festival. This is a very long report about his day on October 7th. And basically, he was at the Nova Music Festival. He fled. At one point, he was at a bomb shelter that came under attack by Hamas, and he survived that. And then he fled to a nearby kibbutz Alumim. And when he was in there, he went into a house to hide. And there was people in the house who were sheltering in some kind of safe room, and they thought he was a Hamas guy, so they called Israeli security personnel, and they went in and killed him. So this is, just another example of Israeli forces. His name was Ofek Atun, killing an Israeli civilian. And we know there was also at Kibbutz Be'eri, where the Israeli tank shelled a house where there was Hamas guys and Israeli hostages, and they killed a lot of them. And they also opened fire at the Nova Music Festival. Some Israeli helicopters hit Israeli civilians. And there was the Hannibal Directive, according to Ynet, that was ordered basically against the cars that were heading back to Gaza. They said, open fire on them, even if there's Israeli hostages. It doesn't matter. So we don't know the scale. I was looking at the latest death toll from October 7th is around 1,100 and around 700 Israeli civilians. So based on these reports of Israel killing Israeli civilians in their response, I'm not sure of the scale, how many of that 700 civilians Israel ended up killing. I know some people have claimed that they know, but I don't think anybody really does. And if you look at the people who are really focusing on this aspect of all of this, which, someone like Max Blumenthal, who's been really critical of the Israeli coverage, the atrocity propaganda, the October, nobody's claiming that Hamas didn't kill civilians. But it's just important to point out the, poke holes in the narrative about October 7th, because they are using it to currently justify this slaughter in Gaza. So I think it's important to kind of focus on these kind of things. All right, so the next one here, China tells the ICJ that Palestinians have the right to use armed force. So this article is from Middle East Eye, and it's a very interesting story because I'm surprised to see that China did this. So this is at the ICJ, International Court of Justice, the trial on Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, separate from the genocide thing. We know what the U.S. did. They went and told the court, you better not call for an end to the Israeli occupation. Don't do that. China, in their testimony, they said that Palestinian people have the right to use armed force to combat the Israeli occupation of their land, calling it an inalienable right well-founded in international law. And if you do look at international law, people under military occupation or blockade do have the right to self-defense. But just to see China, because China usually stays neutral with most conflicts, they've certainly been vocally more sympathetic towards the Palestinians over the past few months and critical of what's happening in Gaza, like most of the world has. But this is a pretty strong statement to hear from China, so I was just surprised by it. I thought it was interesting. Beijing's envoy to the UN said that there were various people who freed themselves from colonial rule, and they could use all available means, including armed struggle. All right, so the next one here. The U.S. sees Ukraine as a military research opportunity. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone. And U.S. officials told the Washington Post, described the war in Ukraine as providing the U.S. with ample information about Russian warfighting strategies. And basically, the wording that they used is they called it bountiful research. That's what Ukraine is to them. It's basically a testing ground, and we've seen this kind of rhetoric before, even from Ukrainian officials. The former defense minister, Oleksiy Reznikov, said, come on, send us all your weapons, talking to the Western arms makers, say, we're a perfect testing ground for your weapons. So this Washington Post report said, quote, the war remains an active and bountiful research opportunity for American military planners as they look to the future. We immersed them in this conflict to make sure they were understanding the implication of for warfare, end quote. So again, just the way that they are viewing this war as things are looking so bleak for the Ukrainians, with the manpower shortages, weapon shortages, and they're saying that they're outnumbered 5-1 in these battles. But it's all good for the U.S. All right, so the next one here, the Ukraine war at 2 years by the numbers. So this article is from Responsible Statecraft. And so Saturday, the 24th, marks the second anniversary of the Russian invasion. And so it's been 2 years of this war going on. And so Responsible Statecraft put together this piece with some interesting kind of numbers. The total money spent by the U.S. is $113 billion. And they're looking for another $61 billion. That includes $45 billion in military aid to Ukraine, $46 billion in economic and humanitarian aid. That's mostly that direct budgetary aid that they call it, that they give directly to the Ukrainian government. $15.2 billion went to the U.S. military. $4.7 billion aid to allies for weapons, other U.S. allies in the region, and then other Defense Department spending at $2 billion. I know some of the deployments were paid for, in Eastern Europe with this money. Some of the weapons the U.S. has sent: 39 of the HIMARS rocket launchers, 76 tanks. That's more tanks than I thought. 3,631 armored vehicles, artillery rounds, over 3 million rounds of artillery, and 400 million rounds of small arms ammunition. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now 43. When the war started, it was 30 to 35. And Ukraine's population in 2021 was 43.5 million, and now it is 37.9 million. And that includes 6.3 million. The difference there is because 6.3 million fled Ukraine. And then there's 3.7 million internally displaced. So it's a shame that this thing is still going on after 2 years. And we don't know the death toll because both sides are not saying how many of their soldiers have been killed, which is just a very strange propaganda thing. They put in some of the estimates here. I'm sure it's in the hundreds of thousands of killed. So it's something I think that'll come to light. I would say hopefully soon, we get a better idea. Whenever a peace deal is signed, then we'll learn about the real death toll. All right, so the next one here, Biden calls Putin a crazy SOB. So President Biden, the diplomat, called Russian President Vladimir Putin a crazy SOB during a campaign fundraiser event on Wednesday, drawing a rebuke from the Kremlin. Biden made the jab at the Russian leader when discussing climate change, claiming it was a bigger threat than nuclear war. Biden said, quote, "We have a crazy SOB. That guy Putin and others, we always have to be worried about a nuclear conflict, but the existential threat to humanity is climate," end quote. If you remember, not that long ago, I think it was like a year and a half ago at this point now, towards the end of 2022, Biden said that the risk of nuclear Armageddon is higher now than ever before. But it seems to be he's almost downplaying the risk now. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov responded to Biden's comments, saying that it brought shame to the U.S., and he described it as Hollywood cowboy behavior. Peskov said, quote, "Such boorish statements from the mouth of a U.S. leader are hardly capable of hurting the head of another country in any way, much less President Putin, but it is a great shame for the country itself," end quote. So Putin responded as well, and he said that the insult was likely a response to him. Recently, Putin said that he would prefer Biden to win in 2024, win the presidential election, than Trump. He said Biden's more predictable than Trump, which I think is certainly true. And so it was funny because, of course, there's still the Russiagate allegations. And so it was funny to see Putin say that. And then you actually saw the Western U.S. media spin it as, oh, he's saying that to help Trump. But anyway, he's basically saying Biden had to react. I don't know. Who knows? It seems like it was Biden just being Biden. I don't think he was specifically responding to anything. So anyway, And then I just mentioned at the end of the story how Biden has totally abandoned diplomacy with Putin and has not spoken with the Russian leader since Russia launched the invasion of Ukraine about 2 years ago now. And the U.S. has cut off most high-level diplomatic contacts with Russia and continues to reject the idea of negotiations to end the Ukraine war. And this is a habit that Biden has, to just throw out insults at other world leaders. Back in 2021, he called Putin a killer, and that sparked a diplomatic backlash. Russia recalled its ambassador over that. And he also has referred to Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, as a dictator a few times now. And one time was right after they talked and they were trying to ease tensions. And then Biden goes out and calls him a dictator. So, again, nothing really new here for Biden. All right, so the last story here. A delegation led by the House's top China hawk visits Taiwan. So a congressional delegation led by Representative Mike Gallagher, Republican from Wisconsin. And he's the chair of the House's China Committee. And him and his delegation arrived in Taiwan on Thursday to show bipartisan support for Lai Ching-te, Taiwan's vice president who won elections in January and will be sworn in as president in May. After arriving in Taiwan, Gallagher took a shot at China in a statement released by his China Committee, which is formally known as the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party. So Gallagher said, quote, "Time and time again, Taiwan has shown the world how to stand up to the CCP's bullying and not only survive but thrive. We are thrilled to be in Taipei to show our support for our friends in Taiwan, President-elect Lai, and the newly elected legislative Yuan. The United States stands with Taiwan," end quote. So Gallagher and his delegation will be in Taiwan from Thursday to Saturday. They met with Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen on Thursday, and she thanked them for putting out statements congratulating Lai for winning the election, because these are things that are very sensitive diplomatically with China. So now we're seeing members of Congress be more openly friendly with Taiwan and making these types of trips more often. And so China is strongly opposed to any contacts between U.S. and Taiwanese officials, and that was reaffirmed by the Chinese Foreign Ministry when asked about this visit. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning said, quote, "Taiwan is an inalienable part of China's territory. China opposes any form of official interaction between the U.S. and Taiwan authorities and rejects U.S. interference in Taiwan affairs in whatever form or under whatever pretext," end quote. All right, so that is it for the news for today. That's it for this week. Go check out our viewpoints. One from Ramsey Baroud, two-state solution as a distraction. The problem is Zionism. One from Scott Horton and Jeremy Hammond, the Israeli state's assault on Gaza must stop. One from Amira Haas, first thing a doctor wants to do is ease someone's pain. In Gaza, that's impossible. One from Ted Snyder, selecting Sersky, the untold half of the Zaluzhny story. Our spotlight is from Doug Bandow. NATO empowers military midgets at U.S. expense. So that's everything. This weekend, I'll be in Mississippi, speaking at the Libertarian Party state convention there. So if there's any libertarians in Mississippi who listen to this, I'll see you this weekend. I'll be back on Sunday, which is when I write and record for the Monday show. I'm going to be pretty late. I'll be traveling that day, but I'm definitely going to do a show. And Kyle Anzalone and I think Connor Freeman as well are going to be doing some writing for me in my absence. But we'll have a regular show for the first day of the week next week. That's it. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, all that. Like this show, subscribe, tell your friends about antiwar.com. I'll see you in a few days. Thanks for listening.